I am very pleased, delighted to be introducing my friend, colleague, and as I said, one of the leading literary critics of our times, Dr. Professor Azat Yeghiazaryan, who will discuss Charents and Revolution. Dr. Yeghiazaryan.
Thank you. At the beginning, I want to thank professors, my colleagues, Giray Libaycan and Georg Bardakyan for the invitation. It is my second lecture in this university. I will speak about the revolution or significance of this subject for the poetry of Yeghiazaryan Charents. In any case, it is a very important subject for Charents. If you want to understand Yeghiazaryan Charents, you have to understand the importance of this subject. But there is an additional argument which make me to speak about it. The fact is that after the collapse of Soviet Union, some critics expressed their doubt about it, others rejected it at all. It is understandable. In the changed conditions, they wanted to make Charents a pure national poet. He, of course, was a national poet, one of the greatest national poets. But this does not prove any way that he was not a singer of the revolution. It is another question, the nature of his revolutionary poetry. It needs to be analyzed. He was born in 1897 and died in 1937. You see, these dates include one of the most interesting and complicated periods of European history. On the one hand, it was the period of revolutionary changes in the mentality and moods of Europeans. Old values and ideas gave way to the new, sometimes strange ones. The whole face of European culture was changing. In the second part of 18th century, a crisis psychology was forming in European literature and philosophy. At the beginning of 20th century, this psychology was incarnated in a lot of works of literature and philosophy. The feeling of crisis became one of the important elements of European mentality, and the World War I reinforced these sentiments. In some sense, what happened to European culture was a collapse. One can't help surprising. European industry and science were developing in spite of the devastating wars, and their achievements are great. But in the area of spiritual life, the signs of crisis became more and more visible. Let us recall just only the names of Baudelaire in France and Nietzsche in Germany. This crisis made Oswald Spengler write an excellent book, The Twilight of West. I think twilight is a key word for this period of European history. The feelings of twilight were spread in all European arts. I would like to remind you of the canvases of Picasso's early period. Some young man is sitting in cafe and looking somewhere. His appearance is a real incarnation of twilight. He sees nothing. Everything in this canvas and in other canvases looks like enveloped in mist, everything in hazy, vague, and indefinite. These men have no past and no future. I believe these canvases are one of the most symbolic European paintings of that period. Alexander Blok, an Russian poet, written in 1813, "We're forgotten, we're lonely. On the earth let us sit peacefully in the warmth. Мы забыты одни на земле, посидим же тихонько в тепле." We are forgotten, we are lonely on the earth. In these words, you can see the psychology of the youth of 1810s. And I am remembering now the words of Armenian poet Vahan Terian, the predecessor of Charents, written at the same times. Մենք բոլորս մանուկներ ենք որբ, մանուկներ ենք մենք կորած հավիտյան անմայր, մենք բոլորս մոլորված անտառում խավար. All of us are orphan children, are lost children, motherless forever. All of us are lost in a dark forest. Let us recall once more the paintings of Picasso. All these young men are lonely on the earth, they are orphans. You can find the emergence of rejection of the old society in these feelings. This society is a group of indifferent men. And the lonely orphan young men feel very intensely the indifference of the other men and women of the whole society. A human being needs love and care of the others, and the lyrical hero of the poets of the beginning of the 20th century is in search of it, but cannot find it. There is no love and compassion in this world. The human community goes to ruins. It is what one can define as a spiritual crisis. All the 19th, 18th century, and especially its second part, is the period of development and spreading of these moods. At the end of 18th century, Russian poetry was involved in this movement. Armenian literature echoed it only at the beginning of 20th century by the poems of Vahan Terian. Now let me return to Yeghiazaryan Charents. The most impressive, really tragic expressions of these sentiments in Armenian poetry we find in his poems. One of them, Personal Song, is one of the masterpieces of Armenian poetry. Here he tells the story of lyric hero's wandering. He leaves his native town, Kars, his friends, his home. He passes, as he says, by the ways of strange cities. Թողած Կարսում գետի ափին տունը շինված անտաշքարով, Կարսը թողած Կարսի այգին եւ հայրենի երկինքը մով, եւ Կարինե Քոթանջանին անգամ չասած մնաց բարով, անց եմ կենում հիմա օտար քաղաքների ճանապարհով. Living in Kars, my house, builded with unpolished stone, living Kars, the garden of Kars, and the blue sky of homeland, and even not saying farewell to Karine Kotanjan, I walk now the roads of strange cities. These melancholy tell a history of great desperation. This young man is lonely in the world, in the whole cosmos. And the word strange is symbolic here. The young man feels that nobody needs him, nobody is interested in his fate. In his soul, a question rises, so characteristic of the young men of the generation. Անց եմ կենում, շուրջս դեմքեր, շուրջս մարդիկ, հազար, շուրջս կյանքն է աղմկում, մարդկային կյանքն անհավասար, եւ ով կաս ինչու ես դու, եւ ով կասի թե ուր հասար, դեմքեր աղ, բութ են այնպես, կարծես շինված են տապարով. I am passing, around me there are faces, there are thousands of men. Around me the life is making a noise, the human life. And who will ask, what you are for, where you have come to. The faces are so stupid as they are made by an axe. In the second lines, we have another comparison. Գորշ տախտկալի ու խելագար երգ է կարծես այս կյանքը մի, ինչ որ մեկի սրտում բացված վերք է կարծես այս կյանքը մի. This life is like a grey, boring and mad song, like a wound in the heart of somebody, To my mind, in the European poetry, you hardly can find such original comparisons. The life in conscience of the suffering young man is something grey and bloody. Charents like these two words, grey and bloody. These words characterize the life in whole, and it is not so difficult to compare the grey of Charents with the twilight of Spengler. The twilight was a universal symbol of the first 2 or 3 decades of 20th century. This situation made the intellectuals to think that the only way was the revolution. In such atmosphere, Charents went to the revolution. In 1918, wrote 2 large revolutionary poems, Crazy Crowds and Soma. In 1920, he entered the Communist Party. But his revolutionary poetry was different from it by the proletarian poets. Proletarian poetry was an important part of the European literature of the first decades of 20th century. These poets surrounded the interests and fighting of working class. Among them, we see such famous poets as Emil Verhaeren, Bertolt Brecht, and others. In the Armenian literature, there was a very talented and known poet, Daniel Varuzhan, one of the victims of genocide, who had written a cycle of excellent poems about the workers' life and fighting. In Soviet years in Armenia, Hakop Hakopian was known as a proletarian poet. Maybe Georg remember. In 20s, Charents called himself a proletarian poet, but really he was not a proletarian poet. He was a revolutionary poet, and is a different one. And the pre-revolution poetry was the proletarian poetry was the part of the revolutionary poetry, but the latter was more profound and more wide sort of literature. The revolutionary poetry was about the soul of the human being. And as I have said, Terian, Charents, Bloch, and others, in their revolutionary poems wrote about the sufferings of the unhappy and lonely human beings. In the revolutionary in the revolution, they sought the salvation for the human beings, not only for the man of a class, of one class. I think a citation from a letter of Vahan Terian, the predecessor of Charents, will be interesting for you. It is about socialism as Terian perceived it. The loneliness is the most unbearable sorrow of the human being. Socialism will annihilate the loneliness. Loneliness is the product of capitalistic individualistic economy. I said many times that one have to not only understand but feel socialism. Socialism is the great union of abandoned, lonely, sorrowful men. If socialism gave only material security, I would never be a socialist. Charents belonged to this group of poets. One inclines to compare his conversation to the revolution with that of Mayakovsky, Bloch, Romain Rolland, Pablo Picasso, and others who sought in revolution and communist ideology the solution of moral problems of the mankind. They believed the new society to be more human and just. The material justice was an important element of this new world, but only an element. Charents and other European intellectuals were interested in building a society where men and women would not be abandoned and lonely. One of the first revolutionary poems of Charents The Crazy Crowds, is devoted to the revolutionary masses. It, in epic pictures, depicted their struggle with the old world, the old society. The poet admired their willing to crush the unjust world to change the society. I believe it is one of the masterpieces of the European revolutionary poetry. All the elements of the poetic serve here to express the fury and strength of masses, crowds. One can see in this poem two elements, the motive of righteous vengeance and the motive of striving for future world. The crazy crowds were eager to annihilate the spoiled old world. The town depicted in frontons symbolized that world. The crowds represent the workers of world. But in their actions, one can see not only the fury and wish to destroy the city, but the willing to build a new world. In this aspect, this poem differs from the recent poems Attila written 2 years before. One may say it was a prelude to Crazy Crowds. But the pathos of Crazy Crowds is the rebuilding of world, and this new element was very important to understand the development of Charents. So in the revolution, Charents saw the way to save the people from their loneliness and abandonment. Among the crazy crowds, among the thousands and thousands, a man could not feel lonely. After the tragic feelings of disappointment and desperation, the masses were perceived as the friends of human beings. The atmosphere of fighting for general ideas made them to feel themselves strong and self-confident. In every case, the admiration with the crazy masses took its origin in this hope. And it was highly characteristic that there was no individual hero in this poem. It was a mighty song about the revolutionary masses, and one can hear in it the music of revolution, as said Alexander Bloch. This admiration connected Charents with Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky wrote a poem, 100 millions with the same admiration. 150 millions, it was the number of Soviet people. Mayakovsky too contrasted the strength of huge masses to the desperation and slightness of a lonely individual. In a sense, the attitude of the poets to the masses, to the crowds, was the same. Both of them hoped to find the salvation of individuals in the crazy crowds. They believed that masses inspired by the high ideals were able to give to individuals a sense of friendship, of love and care. This admiration and belief in the creative strength and abilities of crowds continued until the 20s. But the admiration with crowds could not be cultivated for a long time. Charents inevitably had to return to the fate of the real man, of the individual. But it will be done later in the last period. After his large revolutionary poems, Charents strived to create the image of a new man who principally and deeply differed from the hero of his revolutionary poems. As I have said, this hero was lonely, sad, abandoned, one who wandered in the world without any purpose. The society and other men were indifferent to him. Then Charents started to glorify the revolutionary crowds in which the problem of loneliness was vanished. After these poems, he returned to the individual, to the single human being. But now his heroes were strong, were connected with the crowds, with the other men by tight ties. They were doing everything together with others and for others. These men sometimes resembled the heroes of Renaissance. As an example, I will analyze a poem from his last collection, the Book of Way. It is called the Song Devoted to the Brave Traveler. The theme of wandering occupied an important place in the early poetry of Charents. For example, in one of his well-known poems, The Travelers of Milky Way, he tells about the wanderings of two friends who seek the way to the happy country. They dreamed about the human relations between the human beings, but they witnessed only stupid indifference. We have here an expressive formulation of loneliness. The human being has no friends, no relatives, nobody needs him, and nobody is interested in him except the marginal beings, prostitute and madman. In this poem, Charles depicted a portrait of human being of his type. And his journey is a pure wandering, aimless and useless. This hero has no native land. Everywhere he is a stranger, unknown and unexpected. Now let us go ahead and read the song devoted to the brave traveler. This traveler, really traveler, not wanderer, he is going to his way with a high purpose, to find and bring men new and unknown things, smells and voices, the sun in the night, all the richness and beauty of life. The style is pathetical. The portrait of the traveler is very impressive. Ահավասիկ հակած ուղևորից գեստ և ձերքիդ չուպարած և ուսիտ մախաղ դու գնում ես դեպի հեռուները վսեմ և կորովի և ոգիդ և դեմքդ հանգիստ է և հայացքդ կապույտ ու խաղաղ. Here are you dressed in the clothes of traveler, and in your hand you have a stick, and on your shoulders you have a bag. You are going to the majestic distant places, and your soul is strong, and your face is peaceful, and your look is blue and calm. You see, it is not the sad hero of the previous poem. It is a heroic man who makes us to admire him. Charents uses in these lines and in the whole poem some words from the old Armenian grapar, and it gives to the poem a real impressive solemnity. Հազար կարավանի բերներից ավելի հարուստ կլինի ոգիդ վերադառնալիս, իբրև բարիք կբերես բաղձան կամ բավելի. Բաղձան կամ բավելի կպարգևես նրանց, որ ցանկացան քեզ մահ և կորուստ դառնագին. Your soul will be richer at your return than the burdens of 1,000 caravans, and as a good you will bring infinite longing and will give them who wishes you to die. The entire atmosphere is imbued with optimism and belief to the man who is ready to die in sake of the future of the mankind, in sake of the spiritual richness of the all men. This image of the traveler is radically contrary to the image of the traveler in the poem, The Travelers of the Milky Way. We can find no poem with such mood in the period until the October Revolution in the poetry of Charents. So, therefore, we have all reasons to say that these optimistic feelings are the result of the influence of revolution. We can say these poems are the continuation of the revolutionary poems by Charents. But the tragedy of Charents and many others of his generation in Russia and other Soviet countries was the contradiction between their dreams and the reality of Soviet life. Charents, Mayakovsky, and others remained the believers of communist ideology. They believed in the new future, the right society, and at the beginning they many of them connected all the expectations with Stalin. You know that Osip Mandelstam, Boris Pasternak wrote poems devoted to Stalin. Charents wrote too. But Mandelstam died in the camps. The real life of Soviet people became more and more gloomy. These contradictions deeply influenced the poetry of Charents. We see it on the one hand, the optimistic, solemn poems devoted to the future, and on the other, gloomy, hopeless poems about the fate of man and native country. So he came to contradictions with the authorities. He didn't stop to be communist, though he was dismissed from the party in 1926 because of an incident with a young girl. But the Soviet life has been gradually losing all that ideals which were so important for Charents. And this nature of a free man made him to say things which were accepted as contradictory to party line. For example, Soviet authorities didn't encourage the discussions of the national problems. Their policy was based on the thesis that all the national problems in USSR were solved. But Charents continued to think and to write about the Armenian history, remote and close, about the fate of Armenia. It seems that he proceeds from the Marxist ideology when he said that only Sovietization saved Armenia. But all these poems, in fact, meant that Charents couldn't stop pondering on the recent events, on the genocide. But just these subjects were forbidden in Soviet Union. To his great misfortune, in 1936, Lavrin Beria, that time the leader of Transcaucasus, shot Agassi Khanjan, the leader of Armenian communists, in his cabinet in Tiflis. Khanjan was a close friend and defender of Charents. He highly appreciated the poetic gift of Charents, his services to Armenian national culture and to development of the new revolutionary literature. But Khanjan was condemned as a nationalist. After his death, it was more and more difficult for Charents to live and write. All his enemies now could say everything against him. They called him a nationalist, or he rejected any nationalism. His last collection, the Book of Way, had been arrested because of poems Accals or Pierre and Oracle. In the first, the partisans found unacceptable allusions about Stalin, and one may say they were not very mistaken. Though maybe Charents had thoroughly different goals. He wanted to prove his loyalty to Stalin. In any case, this poem was dismissed from the collection, and Oracle too was thrown out from the book as a nationalistic verse. And only after it, the Book of Way was accepted for sale. All these events happened in 1934, before the death of Khanjan. But even the authority of the Republic leader can't help Khanjan to save the book by Charents. You may imagine the atmosphere in which Charents lived after the death of Khanjan. But even in such conditions, Charents didn't stop to write. After publishing last collections, he created a lot of poems translated from Russian and German. His verses of these last years are very interesting. Maybe the tragic situation around him made his talent more tragic but deeper. All his works of 34, 37 remained in the borders of his classic preferences of last period, but their content is new different from it of previous years. The optimistic worldview is mixed now with gloomy reflections concerning the fate of his people and his own fate. All his friends, writers, artists, party and statesmen were arrested and declared to be the enemies of people. He felt that he will be arrested soon. He tried, as I have said, to show his loyalty to Stalin, began to write a large poem devoted to him. He dreaded death. He wanted to save his life, but he was too clever man and realized the situation. He wrote a poem about Stalin and at the same time called him a bloody cooker. He began to doubt the communist ideology. We can see it in the poem about the last days of Khachatur Abovyan, an Armenian writer of 18th century, who greeted the conquest of Armenia by Russia. In this poem, Abovyan thinks that he maybe was wrong in his attitude to Russians, but his doubts lasted only an instant. It is obvious that here Charents means not only Abovyan, but himself too. The signs of disappointment are already seen in these years. This poem was placed in Book of Way, so was written at the beginning of 30s. But in 36, 37, the doubts returned again and again. I think these doubts were a sort of catastrophe for Charents. The ideal of communism was very important for the poets of his generation. They rejected the past, the old world, and were doing their best for the victory of new world. But when they began to understand that the policy of Communist Party is not what they expected, all the previous life and work creation became something worthless. And what is more important, the best ideals tend to be no real. Such catastrophes have one end, suicide, death. Mayakovsky ended his life by a shot. One cannot say how Charents will end his life if he was not imprisoned. Thank you.